Obviously,
I'm
we don't
recording
want to
this
be
class
recorded.
because a couple of people are quarantined.
I do not
A
consent.
couple, more than one.
more than
No, I
two
think
now?
that, well, Matt is quarantined.
Matt and
I'll check the list just a second. All right,
Y'all are stressing
you're
him
being
out.
preserved for
He stresses himself out.
posterity.
what do you?
Dude, you know what's
what do
like
you
kind of
call
swag?
this?
What?
I'm taking this class and Hamilton at the same time, which she both teaches, and it's like helping me remember stuff. 'Cause
Really?
Yeah, no, it's actually helping me a lot. I'm usually terrible at history. Which I'll probably still fail the test on Monday, but.
I'm scared that I'm gonna fail the test on Monday. Not gonna lie.
Well, here's what you have to do. You have to prepare. The format of the test, as I said, is of all the PRQs and all the readings up till this point, I'll pick 15, and I'll provide the paper and everything. You don't have to worry about that. You'll come in. You'll have the full hour, not just 50 minutes.
We have a full hour to only. That's like 4 minutes per question.
Do you have to? Is it like multiple choice or like you have to write out your answer?
No, you have to write up. Have you
It's
guys been doing the
PRQ,
PRQ?
Sophia.
Oh no, I have. I was just.
No.
No, but-
I'll explain
Oh
again.
my goodness.
The PRQs are your way of preparing, reviewing, and they are also your exam questions. I will pick 15 of them and allow you 10 of them to answer. Now,
Oh, so you don't have to answer all 15.
No.
that's correct. I give you some choice.
Okay.
Did you look at the 2 sample exams from last year?
I'm
that I
trying to find them at the moment, and I can't.
I
Find
did.
Them.
First of all, remember, everything that I send out to you,
Oh, I found
I also put on Canvas. So if you're missing a document, just go to Canvas.
In files.
It's under the Files page. Does that make sense?
Yes. 10 out of 10 stars.
So, and if you have questions that you can't answer in the PRQs, then let me know, although I must admit the test is on Monday, and it would probably have been better to ask me before, but up until 11:55 a.m. on Monday. Now, I have to say some of you don't have your COVID checks activated.
Did I do
No,
that?
it was TJ.
I swear I did.
So TJ,
Yeah.
you have to prove to me that you're a human being here.
Yeah, you have to click that button that says I'm not a robot.
And Sabrina is not here?
Oh, thanks.
So I have to say, you're the only one at this point that,
I was gonna say that for me second.
okay, thank you. God bless you, my son.
Oh, sorry, I have another question.
Yeah.
So as far as you know how there's like dates we have to remember,
Yeah,
those are fill in the blank too?
pardon me?
Those
Yeah,
dates?
those are fill in the blank.
So it'll just have like the event and we have to write the day in the blank basically?
So for instance, on a test that has 10 questions, how much is each question worth?
10.
10 points. So if you divide 10 by 2, what do you get? So what I'm going to have is 5 of the dates that I asterisk, and I'll give the date, and then you fill in the meaning.
So the dates will definitely be on the exam.
They are your first question.
The first.
Yes. I'm giving you a hint.
Okay.
So actually, you'll only have to choose 9 out of 15 questions, because your first question are going to be the dates question.
So as long as we have those dates memorized, we'll at least get like a 50.
Well, you can at least get 10 points.
Oh. Then wait.
All right. Do you have the notes from Wednesday?
Yes.
The ones that say Wednesday on that?
The ones that say Wednesday.
Okay.
So here's where we are in the course. As I following the regime framework of that a political system is a set of core and fundamental ideas, set of institutions that embody those ideas and channel power, laws and policies, and then a citizen way of life. What we've covered in the class so far are the first 2 layers of the regime. The Declaration of Independence, we examined its historical context and looked at the text and its core ideas, and how it provides the governing ideas that really shape American thinking and life. And then we looked at the founding period, which we're just finishing today, and we saw that our first set of institutions, the Articles of Confederation, was in some ways a failed attempt to embody the principles of the Declaration, because remember, the Declaration sets a standard for government. A government can't be so weak that it's anarchical and therefore doesn't secure the rights that the Declaration promises, nor can it be too strong that it becomes tyrannical. So in some ways, the defect of the Articles of Confederation was that on the national level it was too weak, it didn't have enough power and structure to govern, and on the state level, it didn't offer protection enough for minorities, et cetera, and the excesses of the Democratic legislators. So, on the state governments. So then the founding period is kind of sealed by the ratification, the formation and the ratification of the Constitution, and then, so the Constitution then forms this set of fundamental institutions that govern our political life. Now note, by the way, not every important institution that is in the American political system is in the Constitution. The Constitution, as one thinker has described it, is sort of like the genetic material or the DNA of the nation. One of my interesting pursuits for sorts of reasons is I'm interested in identical twins, and specifically at identical twins separated at birth. There's a whole study within the field of psychology of tracking down the characters and lives of identical twins who have been separated at birth. So what's an identical twin genetically? Yeah, I mean, literally, genetically, identical twins are identical to each other. That's why they're called identical twins. Although there are several kinds. There can be some from the same common embryo that split off and have a different placenta. Some don't share the placenta. Some have their own cell phone. And so what's interesting about identical twins separated at birth is that they share the same genetic identity, but they don't have the same living environment. They're raised differently. And it turns out that the result of that field of study is it's estimated that about 50 or so % of our character comes from our DNA. Now, you've heard the expression, this glass is half empty and this half full, right? Thank you. So what does it mean to say that half of your character is shaped by DNA and half isn't? Half of it's your upbringing and your experience. You could easily say that's a lot, isn't it? Well, half your identity is kind of set by factors that you can't control. They're sort of wired into you. But then it also suggests there's a good deal of variety, doesn't it? Now, why am I mentioning that? Because if the analogy to the Constitution is right, that the Constitution provides about 50% of information about our political system, it's also not the whole story. There are all kinds of important, in fact, I will mention, well, two of them right now. There are two major institutions that we'll study in this course, which are not described in the Constitution. One of them is political parties. Political parties grew up in our political system after the formation of the Constitution. They also, by the way, grew up in almost every other modern democracy, like in England, etc. But political parties are an important part of our political system that aren't described in the Constitution. The committee system in Congress, as we'll see when we turn to Congress, there's not a mention of committees in Congress, and yet Congress wouldn't function as an institution without the structure of committees. The system of committees, as you're going to discover, grew during the first decade or so of our country's existence as kind of a felt response to the increased workload in Congress. So there are two pieces of institutional life in America that aren't described in the Constitution, but yet have an important effect. So the last major issue we're dealing with in the founding, I only added this last year, primarily in response to the killing of George Floyd killing and then the public unrest and the protest that ensued from it. Because partially, not simply in response to that protest and that incident, and other aspects of intersections between the police and the African American community and other ethnic communities, but before that, the question of the extent to which the founders, the extent to which slavery and race influenced and had an impact on the founding and the political system of the United States. Well, you could say that's always been controversial. But in 2019, a set of documents was published by the New York Times, which kind of heightened that controversy. And what was those set of documents? Probably you may have actually studied them in high school. Did you go to a high school where you had to read the 1690 Project?
I've never even heard of that.
You've never heard of the 1690
I've
Project?
heard of it, but I didn't have to read it.
Nobody's heard of it? Well, I describe it in my notes, and to raise this issue, we'll look at the central claims of that set of documents. One of the Times reporters, Nicole Hannah Jones, was the leader of the project. And what it was, it published about 10 to 15 different essays under the same rubric that examined certain aspects of the founding and other aspects of American political life. And as you're going to see, there's a reason why it's called the 1619 Project. And we actually talked about this very briefly when I went over the dates for the Revolutionary War. Why was it called the 1619 Project? Why did they call their project that? And you're going to see the title of the project is related to its controversial claims. Why was it called the 1619 Project?
That was the year Jamestown first got slaves.
Right, now the Jamestown colony, which by the way eventually withered and then was replaced by other, actually the official world charter of the Virginia colony. Jamestown was founded in 1608 to 69. The original colony failed, and then of course in 1620, the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower. But it's true that in 1619, the first African American slaves were indentured servants. There's some controversy about the 20 or so African Americans that were imported. But strictly speaking, that marks the beginning of slavery in America, 1619. So it wasn't by accident that the authors of the project chose that as its title. Let me lay out the claims of the project and Hannah Jones in three different aspects. One, the kind of general claim you're making in the title. Two, the specific historical claim, which then became the basis of a good deal of controversial response by scholars, which I've included 2 scholars in the material I sent out to you. And then we'll turn to what I would call the complex reality of race and enslaving of the founders. And for that, the 2 documents that I wanted you to look at were a selection from Federalist 54 by James Madison. And what papers from the Federalist Papers, what paper does Federalist 54 come 3 papers after? You just read this earlier this week.
Federalist 10? Or no, which one?
Federalist 51?
That one.
51, 52?
Yeah, no.
So by the way, to give you some context, if you look at the notes for Monday, I give you an outline of the Federalist Papers. That was to show you from the context of where Federalist 10 and 51 were taken from. And then, because remember, Federalist 51 was the last essay on the general nature of the theory and structure of the Constitution. Starting with Federalist 52 and through Federalist 59, the next essays are about Congress, defending the structure of Congress and the way it was designed in the Constitution against the charges of the opponents of the Constitution. Now later on in this course, we will actually read some of the other Federalist papers from the 50s on Congress. But in Federalist 54, James Madison turns to defend one controversial aspect of the design of Congress, and that is the 3/5 clause. What's the 3/5 clause?
No, you did.
The slaves counted as 3/5 of a person when they were counting population.
That's right. The Constitution, and by the way, you'll see this next week when we start our intensive review of the Constitution. In fact, just let me say right now, we'll look at not only, of course, the structure and content of the Constitution, but we'll look at now this, you have to get the language very carefully here. The 3 clauses of the Constitution that, I'm going to use very careful language here. The 3 clauses of the Constitution that protect but do not legitimate slavery. This is how the controversy rages in the historical discipline as to explain these clauses. So let me say this again. These 3 clauses clearly protect slavery. And we saw when we looked at the Constitutional Convention, when this issue came up in August, it almost tore the convention apart. So this was potentially the most divisive issue in the Constitutional Convention. So as you're going to see, when we read this selection from Federalist 54, you might understand better what I mean when I say these 3 clauses clearly protect slavery, but they do not sanction or legitimate it. What does it mean to sanction or legitimate something?
Approve of?
Yeah, good. In fact, maybe Sammy, that's the better word. So can something protect something without approving it? Without approving of it?
No.
Well, yeah, let me give you an example.
I'm thinking of different stuff in my head and I'm confusing myself.
Wait, can you say the question one more time?
Yeah, can you think, can something be protected without being approved of? Here, let me
Yes,
kind of
that
say,
is-
could your parents agree to let you do something that they don't approve of?
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe, does that help?
Yes.
Now, you can say, well, what's the difference? The Constitution protects slavery. And let me just say what those three clauses are. We're going to come back to them next week. But here they are. Article 1, Section 2. And you've mentioned it, Sydney. When counting the population, because remember, the Constitution turns to population as the basis of assigning representation in the House, right? And in Article 1, Section 2, it says that representation shall be assigned to states according to the total number of free persons, Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons. Now, why does it mention Indians not taxed? If Indians are taxed, what are they considered?
Citizens.
Or at least part of the representation.
And then-
If they're not taxed, then they're members of their semi-sovereign tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, it's true that Native American tribes have this interesting semi-independent status in American public life. That's why they can have casinos in North Carolina, like the Harris Casino, because technically they're partially exempt from state law. They're actually semi-sovereign nations. So that's why it mentions Indian not taxed. And 3/5 of all other persons. Of course, who does that refer to? The 3/5 of all other persons. Pardon? Yeah, slaves, clearly. Now, as you're going to see, Nicole Hannah Jones interprets that clause in a way that many people do. What's the interpretation that she gives or that many people give that clause? When the framers counted African American slaves as 3/5 of a whole person for representation purposes, how do most people understand that?
They're like considered different from every other human.
Right. In fact, she says in her essay, the framers considered African Americans either not full people or only 3/5 of a person.
Right.
So, as you're going to see, in the last essay that I asked you to read was an essay by Robert Goldwyn, Why Blacks, Jews, and Women Are Not Mentioned in the Constitution, because it provides some interesting background about these clauses, but also it's a fitting kind of meditation on the founding and its place in America. So, as you're going to see, that's not historically correct. That's not what the 3/5 clause meant. So, why did they pick that number and what does it mean? We'll get to that. The second clause is Article 1, Section 9. Now, you're going to discover next week that Article 1, Section 9 puts limits on Congress's power. Article 1, Section 8, for instance, gives all the powers that Congress can do. Article 1, Section 9 lists the things that Congress can't do. Now, in the first clause in Article 1, Section 9, it says, no law respecting the migration and importation as such states as existing states now think possible shall be limited or abridged until 20 years after the ratification of this Constitution. Now, when it says migration and importation of certain persons as states in existence now think appropriate, whom are they referring to, and what does that clause refer to?
It's talking about slavery because the framers of the Constitution didn't think slavery would be around in the next 20 years after writing the Constitution.
Possibly, and that many historians think that. So clearly this is the slave trade. Now why is this in the Constitution? Because remember, one of the things that the Articles of Confederation didn't give to Congress was the power to regulate commerce. You're going to see that the Constitution corrects that and gives to Congress the power to regulate all aspects of trade, commerce and trade, so for instance, including foreign trade. So what were supporters of slavery afraid that Congress might do?
That they would take slavery and make it like outlaws.
Well, by the way, it was
Or
clear
tax it.
they couldn't use the commercial power to eliminate slavery in the states where it existed. But what could they have done if Congress has the power to regulate commerce in general?
Tax
Not-
it.
Yeah, not let them buy them or not let them ship them in or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, it could, since the importation of slaves is part of foreign trade, giving Congress the power to regulate commerce could potentially give Congress the power to end the slave trade. Now, I think you're right, Sophie. I think the consensus seems to be that many of the framers thought that slavery would die out naturally anyway. And by the way, we're not going to go fully into this, but the invention of a certain device actually saved the economic viability of slavery. What was that device?
The cotton.
The cotton gin. And it turns out the cotton gin completely changed the structure of the cotton economy, and actually, not only, it actually made slavery profitable. Now, why did they pick 20 years? And of course, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. So what's the year that's 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution?
1808.
1808. And indeed, the first law that Congress passed in 1808 was to eliminate the slave trade. But by then, it turns out, imported slaves were no longer the major source of domestic slaves. It turns out that there was enough of a reproduction rate in slaves that had been born and raised that were existing in America. So in some ways, even though it didn't end the spread of slavery, and in some ways the causes that made slavery profitable weren't understood by the founders, nevertheless, Congress did in fact eliminate the slave trade. So that's the second clause. The third clause is Article 4, Section 2. Now you're going to discover when we look at the structure of the Constitution next week, Article 4 regulates the relationship between the states. For instance, it's Article 4, Section 2 says, if a criminal escapes from one state to another, what is the state where you have to flee? What does it have to do?
Send them back.
Yeah, that's called the Extradition Clause. We have the same kind of treaty with many nations, by the way. Not with all nations, but with many nations. So if a criminal escapes, he has to be returned to the state where he fled. It also says that the public records action laws of one state have to be treated as valid by other states. So for instance, prior to the spread of no-fault divorce in the 1970s, you had to generally get divorced only by cause. If if your partner was committing adultery or was abusive or abandoned you, and only one or two states had liberal divorce laws. Nevada was one of them. So many people that wanted a divorce went to Nevada to get a divorce. And what is Article 4, Section 2? If you get married in another state, it's valid in other states. I live technically in Charlotte, North Carolina, but my driver's license is still a South Carolina driver's license. That's because they don't have state inspection in South Carolina. And so I decided to keep my South Carolina citizenship. But yet, my driver's license from South Carolina isn't only valid in North Carolina, it's valid in every one of the states. Why? Because Article 4, Section 2 says the laws and public acts. That's why you can get married in one state and still be validly married in another. This became an issue, by the way, in the 1990s with gay marriage. Because many states refused to recognize gay marriage until the Supreme Court recognized it in 2015. But strictly speaking, if you were a gay couple and got married in one state and moved to a state where it wasn't legal, Article 4, Section 2 says, nevertheless, your marriage is still valid in another state. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. One of the other things it says is this, Article 4, Section 2. Persons fleeing from service or labor under the laws of one state, fleeing into another state, shall be returned to the person to whom such labor or service is due under the laws of the state. Now, it's very clumsy language. Clearly, what's this clause in the Constitution doing?
Talking about enslaved people who escape from.
Yes. And so what does the Constitution say has to be done?
It's saying that if they escape and they are found, they need to be returned back to their rightful owner.
Right. The Fugitive Slave Clause. And a couple of times in our history, in 1793 and 1850, laws were passed to embody the obligation to return fugitive slaves. And there's some evidence that the 1850 Act actually was one of the contributing factors to the Civil War. More about that later. So there you are, 3 clauses in the Constitution which protect slavery. Why were they there? I talked about this, and we'll see more next week, but do you remember, why are those 3 clauses there, historically?
Why are they there?
Remember when this issue came up in the convention, so why are those clauses there?
To
to keep slave owners happy. I don't know.
Isn't it so?
Without those protections, the southern states would not have ratified the Constitution.
Oh, yeah.
So in other words, it was the price that the Constitutional Convention and the founders had to pay to keep the South in the Union and to accept the Constitution.
And then it became pointless because they seceded.
Well, and then we...
Kicked their butt.
Yes, that's the technical term. So in some ways, as you're going to see, the debate about those clauses, so nobody can doubt that the Constitution protected the institution of slavery. But the question is, does the Constitution legitimate or approve of? And as you're going to see, it's a complex question, and we'll see what Hannah Jones's interpretation is. But in each of these three clauses, what are slaves actually referred to as?
Isn't it person?
Yes. As Goldwyn mentions this, and as we'll see. Now, what is slavery? Marriage. Thank you for answering that. That was Joe. What is it? Shall I answer the question I just asked?
No.
Slavery is when you treat a person as property. So strictly speaking, the question is, does the Constitution treat slaves as persons or property? Well, you're going to see it's complex. Huh?
Well, like Sammy said, the Constitution treats them as property, but in the Constitution it calls them persons.
And
Yeah,
you're
but
gonna
there's also the 3/5 clause.
say what?
There's also the 3/5 clause.
I didn't hear you.
There's also the 3/5 clause.
Yes, but how does it?
But it still counts them as a person in a sense, even though it counts them as part of a person, it's still a person. Like, that's not right, but it's still a
No,
person.
you're going to see, no, because it's actually ambiguous and complex, because, well, you'll see from Madison's Federalist 54, but let me ask, here's the point you'll see when we turn to the Constitution next week. The way I ask this question in one of the PRQs is, where does the Constitution refer to but not mention slavery? In fact, does the original Constitution even use the word slave? When is the first time that the word slave or slavery is used in the Constitution? It's not a trick question, and we'll answer it next week. This will be one of the PRQs I can answer.
Never. I don't know.
In the 13th Amendment. And what does the 13th Amendment do?
Abolish it.
So the Constitution first uses the word slave or slavery in abolishing slavery. Now, let's make sure we don't lose focus with the question. In each of the three places where the Constitution refers to slaves or slavery, it designates them as persons. Even in the 3/5 clause, Sammy, it says 3/5 of all other persons. Now, you're going to see Abraham Lincoln made quite a bit of that. But we'll see that Hannah Jones has her own interpretation on that language. So, with that in mind, let's look at the claims of the 1690 project. Now, you can take the three primary claims and arrange them this way. One makes a general claim, one makes a specific claim, and one makes an even more general claim. Why did they call the project the 1619 project? Obviously for the historical reason, but it was more than that. The editors of the project wanted to make the argument that the real founding of America was not 1776, but 1619. And the claim that the editors of the project make is that slavery is the foundational institution of America. And in some ways, that, as she puts it in her essay, that America has been a slaveocracy from the beginning. So the first kind of claim is that the true founding of America is 1619 rather than 1776, which then, of course, if that's the case, the whole point is to argue that at the center of the American founding is the institution of slavery. Mm-hmm. Is that clear?
Yes.
The second historical claim, and this became instantly controversial and was refuted by many leading scholars and historians, and I give you an example of two of them. One from an essay by Wilfred McClay, who responded to the 1619 project in an essay in Commentary magazine, and the other one by Philip Magnus, who actually wrote a whole book in response to the 1619 project. Now, these two critics of the 1619 Project have different evaluations. Maclay thinks the essential project was misgotten and incorrect. Magnus thinks it has value, but it was excessive in some of its claims, and we'll see what he meant by that. So the second claim was that the main reason why the colonists wanted to rebel from England or separate from England was because England was planning to abolish slavery, and one of the main motivation was to protect slavery. So let me restate that. She makes the claim that the main motive in rebelling against England was to protect the institution of slavery. Now you can tell that that would reinforce the first claim of the title. Now, let me just deal with that because that was the easiest and most controversial aspect of the project. It is true that the Royal Governor of Virginia, William Dunsmore, offered to slave owners and slaves who, if they would, if any of their owners or masters supported the revolutionary cause, he offered emancipation to slaves who would then desert and come over to the British side during the Revolutionary War, or offer compensation to masters. So that is a true historical fact. But what historians argued about Hannah Jones's claim was that it's one thing to argue that in one case, and relatively late in the Revolutionary War, that an offer of emancipation was made in a very limited set of circumstances, and generalized to the motivation of the entire colonies. So the response of criticism, and this is most clear in Magnus's book, is that it's a distortion to actually say that the main motive of the colonists was to protect slavery. And by the way, after some bitter exchanges between the editors of the New York Times and a set of historians who had challenged this, there was a partial retraction. And in fact, they reformulated the claim to say that some of the colonists were motivated by the desire to protect slavery. So in some ways, the most excessive claim of the 1619 Project was the one most easily refuted, and the one in which the editors eventually conceded some truth. Now, the third claim of the 1619 Project is the broadest one, and that is this: that the framers, the founding generation of America, did not consider African Americans to be human beings, that they did not consider them to possess rights under the Declaration. In other words, that the Declaration did not include African Americans. And that in general, the founding generation never anticipated the idea that African Americans would be part of American society. So that they weren't full human beings, they didn't possess rights, and they were not intended to be part of American society. So on that, by the way, you should note something, which I point out in my notes. Now, we've already read material in this course that makes that same argument. Who among the authors that we have read so far make the argument that the framers did not consider African Americans to be rights, to be spoken in the Declaration, and not to be full human beings? We've already encountered actually two authors or two individuals who made those claims. I mentioned it in my notes today, but we read this in connection with the Declaration. I'll give you a hint. Dred Scott v. Sanford, the Dred Scott case. Is it ringing any bells? Let me refresh your memory. Chief Justice Taney in that case made exactly these arguments. Moreover, Stephen Douglas in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, remember the selection from the Lincoln-Douglas debates that we read? That was exactly the issue debated between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. So, strictly speaking, Nicole Hannah-Jones and the editors of the Times make the same arguments that Chief Justice Taney and Stephen Douglas did. So, that's, by the way, that's the question, the deepest question that we're after here with respect to the meaning of the founding and what the framers had in mind. Did the founding generation consider African Americans to be human beings with rights, and did they consider them to be human beings in general, included in the founding, or is as Taney and Douglas, and in some ways the 1619 Project argue, were African Americans excluded from the Declaration of Independence and from the American founding in general? That's the deepest question. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
All right. So let me walk you through the two criticisms. I've already dealt with Magnus's, but you can go back. So if you have the notes in front of you, well, let's by the way, let's refresh ourselves and see her criticism. If you have the notes in front of you
Which?
from Wednesday,
Yeah,
Mondays?
I have them on my phone.
do you have them?
No, I had them on my computer died.
Well, I passed them out too.
No, well, by the time the Wednesday notes got to this side of the room, they was out, because I only got the Monday ones.
You know, life is unfair.
It happens to the best of
I'm
us.
going to walk over to my office and get an extra copy. So who doesn't have the notes in front of you?
Let's do.
Oh, 3.
This is a full-service institution.
Thanks.
Bro, I haven't eaten since 8. I feel like I'm gonna pass out.
I got peanut butter crackers, but they're kind of like, Smushed.
I
not
should-
smushed, they are like crummy though, because I've been in like, this pocket on my backpack for like 2 days.
I should be eating fucking
These
lunch
are
with
literally-
glasses.
I wrote today's notes that he was talking about on Monday's notes, thinking they were Wednesday's notes.
No, I had to check. 'cause-
Yikes.
Hey, bro, have you had that peanut butter in G?
No.
It's good.
Isn't it almond butter or
Is it
something?
really good?
No, the peanut butter, it's like homemade, like it actually tastes like peanuts. It's
Oh.
crazy.
What's today's? Friday.
No, it's
No, the only
Tuesday.
reason I actually checked before is because I think one of y'all had said like, oh, the ones that say Wednesday on the top, and I was like, oh, these definitely say Monday.
I just pulled out the wrong one.
Mm.
Thanks.
Extra copies of the notes, extra copies of the notes. Who doesn't have them? Well, there does seem to be a general deficiency on this side of the room. No.
You need a third one.
Oh, didn't get to you either?
Ooh.
I mean, I can flip up on my phone.
I was gonna
I was gonna say that.
why don't you sidle over and look off of Sydney's? Better yet, for social distancing purposes.
Why can't you just give him one? He's a
Because
person.
they only have extra.
He's
a
5/5
person.
of a person.
You're racist. You're just doing that because he's black.
Ah.
You got me.
You gotta keep.
Well, here.
No, take
I'll
hers.
show him a sexist too.
We can share it, even though I hate being here, TJ.
So turn to the first page.
You sit next to him 3 days a week, bro.
Oh, my hand.
Sophie, on the first page, let's look at the textual foundation of their claims. Do you see where according to Hannah Jones, do you see that?
Mhm.
Read that paragraph.
Oh, I like reading. Can I read? Can I read? I like reading so much.
Go ahead.
Same
Okay,
here.
okay.
Yes.
I hate reading.
It's a novel.
I hate reading that loud.
According to Hannah Jones, the United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, approved on July 4th, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. But the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not apply to fully 1/5 of the country.
And my comment on that is, remember, that's not a new argument. That was made by Tani and Dred Scott and Stephen Douglas. Tiffany, now that you have a copy of the notes in front of you, would you like to read the second paragraph conveniently?
I would not like to because I stuttered.
Can I read again?
Oh, yes.
Oh, I'll read.
Oh, she
Well,
got
no,
it.
Sydney has volunteered enthusiastically.
I'm glad they have two people in this
Hit it,
class
baby.
who like to read.
Conveniently left out of our founding mythology is the fact that one of the primary reasons some of the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. By 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had reshaped the Western Hemisphere. In London, there were growing calls to abolish the slave trade. This would have upended the economy of the colonies in both the North and the South. In other words, we may never have revolted against Britain if some of the founders had not understood that slavery empowered them to do so. And some might argue that this nation was founded not as a democracy but as a slave.
She coined that word.
Democracy,
And
period.
that's exactly what she's claiming. So again, I've already dealt with that argument. That's refuted by Magnus, and I'll talk about it in the third. Now, on the question of the Constitution and the language of the Constitution, she also has an interesting take on this. Amanda, would you like to read? On the next page, so it's not only that she's making two claims about the founding and the Declaration of Independence. Remember, the Constitution, here's what she's commenting on. The Constitution refers to, but doesn't employ the word for slavery. So what's her take on that? Amanda, on the next page, there is no mention.
There is no mention of slavery in the final Declaration of Independence. Similarly, 11 years later, when it came time to draft the Constitution, the framers carefully constructed a document that preserved and protected slavery without ever using the word. In the text in which they were making the case for freedom in the world, they did not want to explicitly enshrine their hypocrisy, so they sought to hide it.
So how does Hannah Jones explain the fact that there's no mention of slavery in the Constitution?
Basically, the white people were cowards and didn't want to be like, oh, we want to keep our slaves, so they were like,
But they
not
knew,
straight
she
up
says,
about it.
yeah, she says, but they knew that it tainted their embrace of freedom, so out of hypocrisy, they hid slavery in the Constitution, yeah.
I was just gonna say somewhere like that they were like that they didn't wanna, like they knew it was bad. And
Now
so,
you
like,
can say,
they
what's the
wanted it.
alternative explanation for that? And you're gonna see Lincoln has a different explanation for that, yeah. Cindy.
So the second claim is the one that they ended up fixing and
Right,
saying
right,
that
right.
wasn't the
When you
reason.
read the Magnus piece, he relates how there was a series of exchanges in which, in essence, the editors caved on the historicity of that point. Now, that leaves, nevertheless, the broader claims to be weighed. So, in some ways, the claim is that the American founding was inherently racist, and that African Americans were not understood to be human beings or embraced within the human rights of the Declaration, or part of the American community. Now, as I already said, Magnus, who details the rejection of the one point about emancipation by the Virginia governor, he still thinks that the 1619 Project, with all of its historical distortions and failings, has value in raising the question of the importance of slavery. Wilford Maclay is a little more critical in rejecting the value of the study in general. So if you have the notes, what's his problem with the 1619 Project? Let's see. Lexi, do you like to read?
Yeah, which paragraph?
Down at the bottom, this is Maclay criticizing the 1619 Project. Here we come to an example.
Here we come to an example of a real failure in our educational system, something that the Times could actually help address. Most of my college students come to my class without any larger context for their understanding of American slavery. They compare the realities of American life against an abstract standard of perfection and find them wanting.
Now, not to say bad things about American college students. I have to say, I generally regret by this point.
You debate, go off.
Here it is. In the last 20 to 30 years, I've watched the knowledge base of American college students decline and evaporate, especially on historical knowledge. Only 19% of all American colleges and universities have any history requirement. What does that mean? It means that most college students come to college ignorant of history, and they leave it ignorant of history. And in some ways, his criticism is the 1619 Project could have addressed that, but failed to because of its excesses and distortions. Continue on the next page. So what is it that most college students don't know historically about the institution of slavery? Continue.
Oh, me? Steph?
Yeah, please.
More
Wait, Sammy wants to read.
Do you want to read? Okay. Moreover, they believe that slavery is uniquely American and uniquely Southern, and that freedom and prosperity are the default position of the human race. They are shocked and disbelieving when they are told that slavery has existed all over the world, in most cultures and most time periods of human history, and that it has in fact been more the rule than the exception in human history. They do not know that the Greeks, the Romans, the Vikings, the Byzantines, the Ethiopians all embraced slavery.
Go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
So, okay. They are shocked to learn that American slavery was exponentially more humane than that of, say, Brazil, and that the American portion of the slaves imported from Africa was only about 4 to 5% of the total number imported to the Western Hemisphere. They are shocked to learn about the role of Islam in the propagation of slavery. They are shocked to know that slavery still exists openly today in countries such as Mauritania and are vaunted agencies of, did I say that right?
Yes.
Okay. Agencies of international governance do little to nothing about it.
So his criticism is, in some ways, that the 1619 Project plays to the ignorance of college students, but when they actually learn the facts about slavery, well, they're shocked to discover these things. Now, this is not an embrace of American slavery. It's just a criticism of the 1619 Project that it could have corrected many of the aspects of slavery that Americans don't know about, but it failed to do that. So the main question we're concluding then is, well, what was? What were the framers' attitudes on slavery, and what was the role and effect of slavery in the founding? So if we turn to the selection from Federalist 54, let me just begin the consideration by saying this. In all of the arguments in the Federalist Papers, this is the only Federalist paper in which one of the authors presents the entire argument, not in his own voice, but in the voice of a fictional character that he creates to present the argument. In this essay, Madison says, as one of our Southern brethren might argue in defense of the 3/5 Clause. So as you're going to see, he invents a character called a Southern brethren, meaning a Southern slave owner, who would come forward to argue for the 3/5 Clause. Does that make sense? Now, why is that important? As you're going to see that interesting final argument that Madison puts into the mouth of this slave owner. So this is something of a long quote, but go down to the bottom. And Sydney, since you're almost as enthusiastic a volunteer reader as Sammy, in this paragraph, Madison is explaining why the 3/5 Clause is there. And by the way, so does Goldwyn. Let me just address that before we get to the text. So what does the 3/5 Clause mean? First of all, who wanted to count slaves as whole persons for purposes of representation? The South did. The North, actually, the Northern delegates did not want to count slavery at all, because they didn't want the South to profit politically from the institution of slavery. So ironically, it's not that the framers considered slaves 3/5 of a human being. They compromised between zero counting and counting as full persons. And it's ironic, again, who and why did the Southerners, why did the South want to count slavery? Because what did it do?
Gave you more help representatives in Congress.
Exactly. So in some ways, Madison's point here, and the framers in general, is this was a concession to slavery, but it was a concession that reduced the political power of the slave states in the constitutional system. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Why didn't the framers, so why would they kind of give them an ultimatum and be like, you can count them as a whole person, but you have to treat them as a...
Because slavery was a legal institution in at least 6 states in the union of 13 states. So, and again, as we saw, the historical reality was, without the concessions to slavery, the South would not have ratified the Constitution. So on one level, both in the Declaration and in the Constitution, the concessions for slavery were made for the historical reality of getting the nation started and founding the Constitution. Does that make sense? So the 3/5 number itself was a compromise between complete counting and no counting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Sydney,
Yep.
in that paragraph, if you see towards the bottom, Madison.
Big one?
Yeah, I don't have page numbers here. Now, where I want you to start reading is, it's where the paragraph that starts, the passage that starts, the federal Constitution, therefore, decides with great propriety. Propriety means appropriateness. The trained monkey standing at the front of the classroom is my department chair, Dr. Dunn.
Okay.
And I asked him to come in and demonstrate that he was capable of basic life skills, like getting food into his mouth, and he could agree to do that.
I would be
together.
kidding.
As Moses said to the Pharaoh, let my people go.
I am hungry.
That's right, let my people go.
Well, let me finish.
Okay.
We do
I
have
By
a
the
name on
way,
this,
don't
Sammy.
forget, if you have snacks for the trained monkey, that would be appropriate.
The federal Constitution therefore decides with great propriety.
We are asking where we are.
Yeah, I don't see where
It's
we are.
like towards the bottom
Do
of
you
the
see
big
the long
paragraph.
quote from Federalist 54 on the page? I'm asking Cindy to begin towards the end. The federal Constitution.
Oh, I see it.
Therefore,
Okay,
it
sorry.
decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves when it views them in mixed character of persons and of property. This is in fact their true character. It is the character bestowed on them by the laws under which they live, and it will not be denied. That these are the proper criterion. I don't know if I said that right. Because
Yeah.
it is only under the pretext that the laws have transformed the Yeah, it's a subject of property that a place is disputed them in the computation of numbers, and it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have taken them away, the slaves would no longer be refused an equal share representation with the other inhabitants.
So what's the critical thing that Madison has his southern brother admit?
That's their part
That they are
property.
subjects of property.
No, that's how the Constitution treats them, because that was the reality of their condition. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
But what does Madison say the laws that treat them as property have done? Taken away their...
Their, like.
So what does Madison, one of the authors of the Constitution and one of the major framers, clearly understand slavery to have done?
Take away their representation.
Well, their humanity.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, there's some evidence that the framers did in fact consider African Americans to be within the purview of the constitutional. All right, we'll see you on Monday. Have a good weekend, and don't get too close to the monkey in the front.
Your people have nothing better to do than spend your time here. That's plain.
Yes, they have something better to do. Ignore you.
I have a wife that does
The great thing
that.
about America is you can talk to your department chair that way. The problem is that I've been trying this for years. That doesn't make any improvements in his favor.
You should let us dress you one day.
What?
I want us to like give you an outfit and like.
As opposed to what? Am I wearing toilet paper?
You're wearing a blazer, a button-up shirt, and sweatpants and pajamas. Like,
That's
that's
his,
his.
that's his, Emma, leave it be, yeah.
Well, wouldn't you agree that that's a kind of a look?
Yeah, but at the same time, I want to give you
It's
another
a
look.
bad
Look, the coat, the black cashmere coat, conveys professional and intellectual respectability.
Sorry, I'm looking at it.
But then you're
Too
okay.
bad, that's what's going on. I'm leaving.
So by the way, it turns out that what I sent you actually did correct some of the things in the first version, but you didn't follow the final version. I did in fact leave out, first of all, I'd forgotten to do the separate graduate.
Well, you don't need to worry about that so much because graduate school does it on special topics. They just let you use the special topics and they don't have to have your topic.
Well, and if you told me a certain person that submitted a proposal last year that was not only supported but lauded by the committee, didn't do any of that either. So anyway, I did that, and I did in fact stipulate the course objectives, but that was in the final version I had sent you. And it's true. No, by the way, actually what you sent her still had some mistakes in it, like you left the title of the graduate seminar off, the graduate course. You just cut it off. You revised it. So what I did was, I made all the changes, I'd already made all the changes you proposed anyway, with the exception, I didn't list every source for the visual material, because that's ridiculous anyway, because I provide them. So what I did was I added the phrase, provided by the instructor. Do you have a question?
Hi, I'm Sam.
No, I was writing over my work.
Okay.
I'm the boy's favorite.
Thank you for
Yes, ma'am.
today. I will see you Monday.
I'll look at it. So I'll,
I'm going to the library.
I'll see you Monday to fill that test. What?
God bless. So by the way, I actually don't think she was trying to be harassing. At first I thought you were right, because this whole business, you have to list the source of every visual material. I was gonna write a note to her and say, where did this come from? It's not in the requirements of the form, and I've been using extensive visual materials in my courses for 36 years, and this has never been required before. She actually thought it was improving the syllabus by showing students where this material is available. But that's a necessity
if they have to get
if they
it.
have to get it.
So you're going to show everything in class.
Yes. So, don't get me wrong, I understand. So after I thought it through,
Used for this.
it wasn't as, she wasn't being a stupid bitch.
That's rare.
I think she was actually trying to be helpful. But it turns out that, but still, I must admit, maybe I've become persecutorial or paranoia, but the problem is you never know.
Well, I'm going more and more to just posting links and letting them do it on themselves, and that saves class time.
Well, and there are many aspects of normal life skills and intellectual habits that our contemporary college students are deficient in. But one thing they are not deficient in is they know where to find media, usually without paying for it. So.
How does this American government?
It's okay. The Hamilton course is pretty good.
I mean, they look like they were rather reasonably engaged, of course, they're only about seven.
Well, the reality of PRQs is, the first test is Monday, so, and you know what? You can give the material out at the beginning of class, you can re-explain it, but it isn't until the night before that it finally dawns on them.
My first exam, person made 2. I've got 100 points. Made 2. Another one made 10, another one made 13, another made 16. I mean, what do you do?
What do you do?
Huh? You can't. I mean, I went on a tirade. Just saying, look, there are a certain basic things you have to know to teach. I said, if you wanted me to teach college math, and you come in, teach this course in college math, and nobody in the course could do the multiplication tables or how to do division, I can't teach the course. It is not possible. I don't care how brilliant I might be. I said, if you have never heard of the Soviet Union, is what I'm saying. What is that? I've never heard of it. There's a certain basis that you've got to establish. You can't, as a beginning point to teach.
And the problem
They
is,
have none of it.
and it's a twofold problem, not only, of course, that's a generic problem in American academic life, but this institution, the leaders of this institution made a decision as to how to chart the future of this institution. And that was to abandon its liberal arts core and to abandon the standards of even minimal competence, so as to increase the enrollment. The second problem is then they turn that problem over to us. They try to address it medicinally with the student success seminars, but they really put the onus on us with the clear message that it's up to us to make sure that these people pass our class. They want us to be college versions of every school administration.
They have to be successful.
Well, that's correct, and if they're not, it's our fault, we're bad teachers. And they want us to be embodiments of the same system that has passed students without having any knowledgeable skills. So, I don't even know whether one should be angry at this, but probably you and I and other people that make the argument that you have to possess minimal skills to be here are probably going to come under a certain amount of pressure and criticism. Now, it's true, the individual who is most vocal about that is no longer with us, may he rest in peace. But the attitude is embodied in the institution at this point.
Well, and the other thing is just that, like, I have this student. She has quarantine for 10 days. She had been.
Oh, we're still recording this class. Go ahead.
She had been quarantined earlier. So I get this email.
Uh-oh, that's,
What
everything we just said has been recorded for.
I think you can go back and erase that latter part. You could kill it.
I suppose.
Well, you can. I've done it.